Rucham Abayim to the 17th in the series of lectures, shiurim, on the section of the Guide for the Perplexed, where the Rambam elaborates his negative theology. Last Shia we ended in chapter 65, and I noted that the Rambam makes a very subtle turnabout in which everything he said in the Moed Vuchim about negative theology, he's about to violate the entire thing. Okay? Let's go back a little bit, beginning in chapter 65. First of all, we have to understand that in the Moed Vuchim, the Rambam doesn't tell us really what he's doing. Most of the time, he's decoying us. But just like at certain times, he makes flashes. The Rambam actually says this explicitly in his Akdama. He speaks about lightning flashing. He speaks about paying attention to the different prakim, etc., etc. In other words, basically, the Rambam speaks, and then once in a while there's a flash. And what?
I don't know when he's telling that.
Well, you have to have an intelligent reading of the Moed Vuchim. The Moed Vuchim obviously is only meant for very few intelligent people, and that's part of what the Rambam is actually doing. The Rambam, the Moed Vuchim is transmitting secrets which are not supposed to be transmitted. The Rambam discusses this in his Pesicha. So how do you do? So basically, there's an esoteric and exoteric message to the Moed Vuchim. For the most part, the Rambam is basically, telling people things that they already want to know or already know. And there's only at different points that the Rambam is making subtle changes that the informed reader, the reader to whom he's aimed at, right, is going to pick up and understand what he's doing. Now, the Rambam has basically spent many chapters convincing us that, in fact, the Kadosh Baruch Hu cannot be described in any affirmative, with any positive description. And of course, we cannot in any way associate any act with God. So when the Torah speaks, for the Rambam, in other words, when the Torah speaks about acts of God, what the Torah is referring to, it doesn't mean literally God acts. God cannot act in the way human beings act, because that would impinge upon God's absolute unity. But rather, that the Torah is in fact actually just describing a phenomenon in nature and attributing it to God. Okay, we've had 15 shiurim, 16 shiurim of that. Now, the Rambam actually continues that in chapter 65. The Rambam says, similarly, when it says a Kadosh Baruch Hu spoke, doesn't mean that there's an act of speaking of God, but rather somehow there's a sound wave, there's a sound, like any phenomenon in nature, and we associate that sound wave with God. But there's no act of God speaking. Chas v'shalom. That's a violation of everything we've spoken about. Every notion of God is paganistic. Now, so in other words, that's what the Rambam is doing. The Rambam, in chapter 65, speaks about God speaking, and he says everybody agrees that Torah was created. In other words, when God speaks, he creates speech. It's not an act of God, but basically it's a phenomenon in nature. I hear a sound. Today we would associate that with the vibration of molecules of air, and I associate that with God. But there's no act of God speaking. God can't speak. That's a violation. But it's interesting that the Rambam begins the parak after you reach this madrega. After you reach this level. What do you mean after you reach this level? I mean, the Rambam's been doing that. Not only has the Rambam been explicating this in the chapters of Negative Theology, he's basically spent most of the first section of the Moed Vuchim explicating this. I mean, chapter after chapter of the Moed Vuchim is devoted to taking words in the Chumash, expressions, which appear to be anthropomorphic, and the Rambam says don't understand them literally, but rather, in fact, these words have to be understood as some metaphoric, or they're communicating an idea. So the same thing with people, with Amira, right? God speaking doesn't mean that God is actually speaking. It doesn't mean that people are hearing the voices of Kadosh Baruch Hu, but rather I mean, that they associate, they hear God speaking, but rather people hear sounds, and these sounds are like mountains and rivers and trees that were created by God. It's interesting is that when it comes to Har Sinai, the Sefer Rabbi Yehuda Levi in the Kuzari is also bothered by this, and he doesn't know what to say. You know, Rabbi Yehuda Levi says, I mean, how can the Kodesh Baruch Hu speak? On the other hand, he says, what can you do? They heard what they heard. I mean, that's what happened. You can't deny it. They heard something happened. He doesn't know. I don't know how to explain it, but they heard what they heard.
Why is there any prophetic experience? Why Har Sinai specifically bothers him?
No, because no, but who, the Kuzari?
Yeah.
Oh, because in the Kuzari they were awake. In other words, a prophet normally could be you know in the sleeping, but here they were awake and they heard voices. Okay, fine. Now, the fact is that the Rambam, however, makes a subtle change. After the Rambam has convinced us that we cannot ascribe any act to God. God doesn't act, because an act basically would treat God as, would violate God's unity, would violate God's incorporeality. But the Rambam has made a subtle change. The Rambam said on page 167, I'm going back again on the previous shir, that Dibur and Amira can refer to several things. They can refer to actually making sounds. That's on page 167, second paragraph. Pronouncing words. But Dibur and Amira can also speak about thinking something. In other words, the Torah sometimes uses Aleph Mem Reish and Daleth Beis Reish to refer to a person thinking. And then sometimes it means a person willing. Now, the Rambam says on 168 that when we associate Dibur and Amira with the Kadosh Baruch Hu, sometimes, right, we have the second associations, which are expressed through sound. What means expressed through sound? When you say God wills, God thinks. You're actually speaking about God willing, God thinking. In other words, will and thought is nothing created by God. God actually wills, God actually thinks. And just for coming attractions, the Rambam is going to say actually in chapter 68 and 69 that God's thought is his essence, God's will is his essence. A total violation of negative theology. Total violation. The entire Sefer is turned upside down. Okay? The Rambam probably feels that the unintelligent readers probably fall asleep by now. He's not interested in what the Rambam is saying on and on and on. Sometimes the Rambam will put in a flash of lightning, and then he'll spend a few chapters boring you again. And then you fall asleep, and then after that comes a parak and the Rambam states it outright. That's the Rambam does use this many, many times. For example, at the very end of the Magen Avuchim, the Rambam speaks about 3 levels of madrigas, of man, perfection. One is, I think, the possession of material possession, wealth. One is ethical possession, which is mitzvahs. And one is philosophical perfection, which is chachma. And that's the highest perfection reached by man. And then the Rambam spends a few parakim splitting more terms, this and that. Then all of a sudden the Rambam contradicts himself completely in the very last paragraph of the Magen Avuchim, speaking about imitating God in ethical perfection. I mean, what does that have to do with the violation of the previous chapter? In any case, the Rambam used this ploy over and over again. Now, he's going to use this ploy over here. What the Rambam does is, kinoi, right? Harotzen v'hachefetz. Denoting rotzen and chefetz, denoting will, by Amira v'dibur, harei hu behetem l'mashbuyos shel shitav habitoy zeh. In other words, denoting will by Aleph Mem Reish, Daleth Beis Reish, are actually similar to the way it's used with human beings. K'fi shivhan, like we explained. V'chem mitoch dimoy eleinu. K'fi shizbanu l'fnei. Okay, right? Right. In other words, when I use Amir and Dibur Gai B'Kadosh Baruch Hu, it's similar to the way I use it with human beings. Sheberega Rishon and Adam Mevin Ketzan Nasa Ma'aser Asher Roitzim Lasoisoi B'Emtzos HaRotzen Greater Ella B'Mat Rishon Hekrechu Sharoitzu is a Dava Yasa is a Dava Sharoitze Shimotze Yitzavol Losloso. In other words, a person will something before he does something. L'chein, therefore, Yuchas Lakel, therefore we will associate with God B'Hashala, using the same term Hatzivoy, we say God commands. It's what God wants. But wanting is a real verb with God. There's no object, phenomenon called will. V'nemar, just like what says the Rambam, I'll use, when Dibo and Amira refer to will, I'll use that in the same way with God as I use it with man. An absolute rejection of the last 16 lectures. We're comparing God's acts to man's acts. Ashrek. So, for example, Ma'aseh Bereshis, Vayom Elokim Yior, what does that mean? It says Rambam, God wanted. Isn't that associating with God a desire, a human thing? In that sense, we could compare man with God. Just to show you, indicate to you, right, is that the fact is that the Rambam, right, says that God's Ratzon is part of his essence. Says the Rambam, page 180.
Which chapter?
Chapter 69, in section 1, towards the end of the chapter. God's will, or Chachbasar is wisdom, things that are chutz liatzmusai. God's will is chach, but not something outside his essence. That means they're part of his essence. What the Rambam says in chapter 69. Very interesting. Basically, the Rambam has made this change over here. And I'll tell you the truth, it has to be. Why? Because it says God spoke. Who's he speaking to? In Ma'aseh Bereshis, who is he speaking to? So let's say, look about excusez, who before Samoid. Right? It says the Rambam, how do I know that when it says he's here is speaking to his will? In other words, he's not speaking to a person. Okay. Now, what the Rambam is saying over here, right? Hakavana hazayis, when it says that Kosh Baruch Hu created these things, it comes from God's intention and his will. No one denied this. Everybody picked this up, says the Rambam. Everybody picked this up. And I'll tell you that they can mean the same things. No, Diba don't mean the same thing. In other words, what the Rambam has done right now is he's made a detour, he's made a change. He has said that there are certain verbs, to will, to want, we're going to say to know, to think, that actually these are terms that we can use with respect to God, and we don't have to use the negative theological exception of referring to phenomena and associating them with as creations of God. But actually God wills and God thinks, just like a person wills and thinks. That's the Rambam is saying. Incredible. Okay, now, like I said before, what's a way in which I know that the Rambam is flashing a light? How do I know that the Rambam is flashing a light? Well, one of the ways I know that is the Rambam takes another detour. In other words, when the Rambam says something subtle, then he's going to take a detour, then I know that he flashed something. So basically, in Prokim Samach Vav and Samach Zayin, the Rambam takes a detour. He speaks about, when it says Ma'aseh Elokim, about the Luchais, that they were etched, and this was an act of God. I'm not going to go through Parat Samach Vav. You can read it yourself. Very easy. Parasamach Zayin, what does it mean God rested? It means he didn't create anything. In other words, don't think that Kodesh Baruch Hu rests, he didn't create anything. Vayonach v'yem hashvi means he didn't stop creating things. It's no actual rest. In other words, so the Rambam in Perek Samach Vav, Perek Samach Zayin, basically goes back to the negative theological concept of Scripture, where, in fact, actually, the verbs are either referring to phenomenal nature, or they're referring to, in the case of God resting, that basically, in other words, God did not do something. In other words, there's no phenomenon associated with it. Okay, now that we went to, let's go to Perek Samach 68, because here comes the Rambam, and the Rambam is going to speak about God thinking. And we're going to see in chapter 68, Perek Samach begins on page 173 in the Schwartz edition, that God thinks like the way a person thinks. We think the same way. We'll see there's going to be a difference. God is always actively thinking, and sometimes we're thinking, sometimes we're sleeping. Sometimes we're not thinking. But the Rambam begins Perek Samach as follows. Yodea ato. You know, Kama Mufosemes Oisa Amira, the famous statement, Asher Oimem a philosopher, which the philosophers speak about, Al Oides HaKel Yisrael, about God. The philosophers, a very famous statement about God. For who, he, Shem Oimem, what is the statement of philosophers about God? Shua Seichel, that God is intellect, Hamaskil, he's intellectualizing, Vamuskal, and the object of that intellect. In other words, there's three parts. There's the Gavra, that's the Maskil, the Chepsa, the object, the Muskal, and then there's the verb, the Pa'ula, Maisa. Gavra, Chepsa, Maisa. Okay? So, Gavra is the Maskil, the Muskal is the Chepsa, and the Maisa is, right, the Seichel. Now, Kodesh Baruch Hu, we say that all three are one. In other words,
The kosher trinity.
the kosher trinity. Oh, we spoke about this in the Chibureinu Haggadah. Where is that? That's obviously in Hilchos Tshuva Perek. Actually, it's also in Perek Beis 2 in Yisei Torah. שכן זהו יסוד של תרסנו כפי שהסברנו שם. דהיינו שהוא אחד בלבד ואין לצרף אליו דבר אחר, כמובן שאין דבר קודם זולוסי, לכן אומרים חי השם and אומרים חי השם. In other words, you can't describe God as anything, there's nothing outside of God. A description of God can be outside of God. So if you actually do describe God, he and the description will be one and the same. שכן אין חי דבר זולוסי עצמוסי כפי שהזכרנו הבנו על שלילת התורה. In other words, the only thing you can say about God is God's essence. Something which is not God's essence, you can't describe him. What does that mean? That thought is part of God's essence. God's essence is his thought. That's the implication. He's going to say that explicitly at the very, very end, that God's essence is his thought. But there's anyway, yeah.
Did you say that if God is described by something, that means he is limited, therefore he has to be the thing? Is that what
No, we're saying like this. If God cannot describe anything outside of him, but you could describe by something of God that's him himself. In other words, if you describe God by, in other words, negative theology is you can't describe God something outside of him, walking, talking, etc., etc. If you do describe God in a kosher way, then it has to be something that's part of God too. So if you describe God and say God's thinking, that means that God's essence is his thought, which means he doesn't think something outside of him, but rather his thinking, the object of his thought, and the thought itself are all one.
And if you would say walking?
No, walking is different, because walking is outside of him.
It is.
That's the meaning. Okay, now, says the Rambam, ain't Suffolk. Now, says the Rambam the Chiddush. What's the Chiddush? Let me explain to you what the Chiddush is going to be. So, about man, we say the same thing. In other words, it's only God that has this trinity of thought. Man also has this trinity of thought. Says the Rambam, ain't Suffolk, there's no doubt. Shekol mi shelo hibit b'sfarim shechubu l'idus haseichel. Whoever has not read books that are written about the intellect, lohisik as atzmos haseichel, has not really understood really what intellect is. But any day is mahusai. Doesn't really understand what it is. Ve'enu mevin ela kamo shmashu mevin mashmos halev mashachar. He only understands things like black and white, colors. In other words, if you haven't read books about intellect, you only know about black and white, colors, black and white, so it's going to be very, very difficult for you to understand this, says the Rambam. Very difficult to understand this. The Banu, we have said, Shehu HaSeichel, God is intellect, Hamaskir, the intellectualizer, V'hamuskal, the object of thought. Yebe'en of Gilamanu, it's like you think when you say that, so the Amaretz will say, Halubin, Hamulbin, V'hamalbin, Davar Echad. He'll say that the person, I guess is speaking about white, right? Speaking about white? He'll say, if you paint something white, so the painter, the color, and the thing you painted are one and the same, so you'll laugh. So people are going to say, that's stupid. How could you say that? Now, the Rambam is clearly speaking to his intended audience. He's left the other people aside in the last two chapters. People think, well, this is an abstract thing, but it's really very clear. You can prove it, you can really demonstrate it. Just like the philosophers, the theologians have explained it. On page 174. I'm going to explain to you what it is, says that Rambam. Which means, what's the Rambam going to say? The Rambam's going to explain to me how it works with a person too. Because the Rambam's going to say that the thinker, the object thought in thought, is not a statement that is true about God. It's true that applies to any person who's actively thinking. And that's what he says. Da. Okay? This is what he's going to prove to me. Now, before a person thinks about something, he can potentially think about something. In other words, everybody's a potential thinker. There's hope. Right? There's hope for you, for all of us. But when he's actively thinking, because a person is a piece of wood that has a certain structure. So, for example, he says that this piece of wood is a square. In other words, you have, let's say, this table is a square. So when a person looks at the table, so of course the table is a physical table made of wood. But the person who's intelligent understands that there's a surah, which is an abstract square, like the Rambam says, he's able to bring out the abstract figure. Actually, this is actually not a square, this is a rectangle. But in other words, he's able, when a person looks at the table, and I say, what is the shape of the table? And I say a rectangle. Now, what a rectangle means, there's four sides, and all the angles are right angles, and all the properties of the of a rectangle. So what the person does is he looks at this physical piece of wood, and he abstracts out a rectangle, and says the Rambam, right? This is an action of the seichel. Zois pulas ha-seichel. This is what the seichel does. In other words, what is a person? In other words, azayu nasa maskul b'poya. In other words, what is a person a gavler doing seichel? What is he? In other words, when is he an intellectualizer? What he's doing is he takes a piece of wood and he picks out an abstract surah figure of that wood. So what does it mean to say? The intellect, which became active, because now there's a rectangle. In other words, basically, seichel means this rectangle, which I have pulled out of this object by virtue of my intellect. The thing which I'm focusing on, is the tzura, the figure, the rectangle of this piece of wood. And it's the seichel, which means it gets this abstract rectangle, that became active. They're not two things, two separate things. In other words, the seichel, the intellect, the rectangle, and the tzura, the thing which I'm intellectualizing, the wood, are one and the same. In other words, basically, seichel, intellect, and the thing which I'm, the object intellect, are one and the same. In other words, basically, right? The thing which in other words, this thing which has been apprehended, right? And who's apprehended? No other than the maskil. That's a seichel that becomes active. In other words, says the Rambam, Kipulasai shall call seichel hi atzmusai. So basically like this. The Rambam says is, when a person thinks, when a person uses his intellect, that's his essence. Because he and the object and intellect are one and the same. In other words, I think the way God thinks. In other words, don't think that when I say God is both the thinker and the act of thought and thought itself, don't think that's some type of a metaphysical statement which is meaningless, because if you think about it, that's what happens when a person actively thinks. In other words, the seichel is not one act. It's not something which is different from the action. They're both the same thing. Because the seichel is really the hasaga, which is the intellectualizing activity of the person who's thinking. So he says, etc., etc. Okay? So, says the Rambam, we've come to the conclusion that the unity of the intellectualizer, object of intellect, and intellect, is not only a property of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, like the philosophers say, but it's also a property of man, anyone who's thinking. Says the Rambam, the last paragraph, 174, this is very clear. Whoever's thought about this, whoever learned about this, in other words, when a person is thinking, his essence is his thought. Will tell us to etc., who are maskil, etc. He prays it over and over again. Okay, so now, page 175, repeats it over and over again, makes this very clearer. Bola Eifel. Therefore, I'm on the third line, page 175, the Schwartz edition. Bola Eifel. It's ever clear. Shekasher HaSeichel Dintzeh B'Poel. So therefore, when the Seichel is active, as HaSeichel Hadavar HaMuskal. When the intellect is active, it's at one, it's the same thing as the thing that's apprehended. So the person who's thinking, that becomes his essence. Mikan, whenever a person thinks, the seichel, the maskil, the muskal are one. Okay, so how come man is not God? So what's the answer? But when a person is not thinking, so then they're separate things.
I hear more that the maskil and the muskal are the same thing, the seichel and the muskal are the same thing, but the maskil and the seichel are the same thing?
Because they have to be, the transitive law. If A is B and B is C is A is C. That's what it is. In other words, but when a person's not thinking, some of you are falling asleep, people are not thinking, a seichel b'koyach, a muskal b'koyach. In other words, the seichel b'koyach, the muskal b'koyach, Kilomar Secha Hayule Yashabuven who Seichel Bakoyach. Because everything is potential states, so they're different. In other words, they only become the same when they're active. When a person is not thinking, so the two things basically are dormant. And always is a potential state. So suddenly the two things, separate things. But I actively think about it, becomes equal, etc., etc. Okay, fine, now. Okay? In other words, anything which is potential has to be a property of someone, of something. And that's a person. So therefore, in other words, since a person can potentially think, but he's not always thinking, so says the Rambam, there'll be three things. Number one, a person is a potential thinker, intellectualizer. Two, it is the intellect which is in potential. And three, the thing which is going to be apprehended. In other words, when you say there are three things when a person, right? When a person is potentially thinking but not thinking it actively. Okay? But when a person, no words, but when a person starts thinking, they all become one. In other words, when you're sleeping, there are three things. When you're not thinking, there are three things. But when you start thinking, they become one thing. In other words, only separate things when it's potential. Now, so what about the Eibishter? What about the Tate, Kodesh Baruch Hu? Says the Rambam, no, God is different. But since it's been proven, it's been proven rigorously, it's been demonstrated. God is always actively thinking. We began the parak like that, the chapter like that. God is not potentially something, because God is nothing, but there's two states of God. And therefore he's not one, he's two. When Eliyahu Navi said to the Baal, maybe he's sleeping, he was making a very, very incredible statement. He was basing himself on the mind of Uchan. God is always actively thinking. Kafish's Barak has been made clear. That can be proven. I'm on page 176. If God is not always actively thinking, sometimes he knows, sometimes he doesn't know, sometimes he apprehends. That can't be. Paganism. There's two gods. The sleeping God and the waking God. God's thought is his essence. Okay? However, says the Rambam, what was the point of this chapter? What was the point of this parak? Says the Rambam, Bala Eifa. He said this several times, but now he's telling you what he really means it. Bala Eifa, Shahayois Haseichel Hambaskel Vamuskel Echad B'Mispa. That which we say the Seichel, Maskel, Muskel are one. It's not only God. And look how he's every Seichel. There's nothing special about God's Seichel. It's just that God is always using a Seichel. And man is sometimes not using a Seichel. Gambanu, also with us. Hamaskil, Haseichel, Hamuskel are Dava Echad, the one thing. The only difference is, but we go in and out. Now, if you'll notice, the Rambam's repeated himself a lot in this parak. Well, the Rambam knows he's repeated himself a lot. In fact, the Rambam says in the very final paragraph, Anu Chazal Eidin Zeh Perek Zeh Pam Mizpah. We've actually repeated ourselves a lot. Mikevan, why? Shatfisa Hazois Zara Ma'ai. Because it's very, very strange. I think it's very strange. Very alien. The das. In other words, it's a very alien thing to understand. Any sova sha'ata tevalbel as a tfisa sichlis hazois about dimyo and the kita shashtkafos hamuchash b'koich habedama. Don't use your stupid, in other words, imaginative understandings of things to ruin this concept. In other words, the Rambam says this is something you could easily mess up with. Don't, in other words, try to think abstractly, says the Rambam. Don't, in other words, don't use your common sense intuitions of things and therefore implode this concept. Because this book was written to people who learn philosophy. And you truly understand with clarity things about the nefesh. Now, the fact is that that's what the Rambam has said the purpose of the Sefer was. If we go to the Pasicha, which in the Swartz edition is number 10, I've actually spoken about this, we spoke about Moshe Rabbeinu. Says the Rambam, the purpose of this book, right? Purpose of the entire book, right? The true science of the Torah, the true wisdom of the Torah. Yes, Came. Moreover, right? Who's learned philosophy, right? Right? And human intellect is important to him. To understand certain things. Okay? We spoke about, the Rambam also speaks about in different cases, the purposes of the nefesh of a person, that was Moshe Rabbeinu. It's clear, right, that the Rambam says, I'm repeating myself over, which means more than that. What the Rambam is really saying is that this parak is fundamental, because that's exactly who the Rambam is aiming at. In other words, this parak, this chapter, is one of the what? Is actually in which the purpose of the Moreh Nevuchim is clearly being explicated. Now, what is this? What is this purpose of the Moreh Nevuchim? Okay. First of all, we haven't done the Moreh Nevuchim from the very, very beginning, but I've referred to this several times, that the first chapter of the Moreh Nevuchim speaks about what's called Tzelem Elokim. And for the Rambam, what's called Tzelem Elokim is the seichel of a person. What has the Rambam done now? The Rambam has basically turned himself 180 degrees. At the very end of Negative Theology, when I've been convinced that there's no connection between man and God, there's no way that man can possibly understand God's essence. The Rambam repeat himself over and over. He's one, right? But not a oneness, concept of oneness. He exists, but not by virtue of existence, right? At the very end, the Rambam says, you want to know something? God thinks the way you think. Except that God is always thinking, and sometimes you're not thinking. But you know what? The same things I say about God's thought that constitute God's essence, the same thing we said about a person. Which means, what the Rambam is saying is that don't think that your thought operates differently than the way God thinks. You think like God. You think like God. In fact, says the Rambam, this sounds like a very strange thing, because we tend to think that we don't think like God. Says the Rambam, that's dimyon, that's imagination. That's people who are caught in imagination because they're unable to understand a certain philosophical truth. The philosophical truth is that what we describe about the thought of God, which is obviously his essence, right, is in fact none other than a description of the thought of man.
Didn't we say by God's thought that God thinks the thought and that thought thinks the thought?
That's an act of creation.
But isn't that constant? Isn't that God's constantly creating the world?
No, but he could think thoughts too. Okay, fine, but the act of thinking. God, in other words, God's thoughts can, in fact, actually, it's God's thoughts create thoughts. That's in, Parakut Beis, Chelik Beis. But then the Rambam was speaking about the creation of the world. In other words, the Rambam asks the question, how does God create the world? Creation is an act of God too. So the Rambam says basically God doesn't directly create the world. He thinks thoughts, and Mamela, there's a process in which the thoughts actually, somehow think thoughts and create thoughts, basically on a world. But that's an act of creation. But here we're speaking about the actual act of thinking. We're speaking about the actual act of thinking.
The original thought in that process.
Right, original thought. God's act of thinking.
But God's.
In other words, God's thoughts, are a creation of God too. There was speaking about God's thoughts as creations of God.
Fine, but that's not true by a person.
But it's not true by God either. But the act of thinking by God. In other words,
There's a huge difference though between
What?
God's. There's a qualitative difference between God's thinking and man's thinking now.
No. The Rambam there is just discussing how did God create the world. God thought a thought, and the thought somehow is a process. In other words, when God creates the world by thinking a thought, and that thought, that type of thought that basically goes on and creates a world. But there's an abstract concept of thinking.
But the thought that he thought was
But thought of God's initial thought was to think about a world or to think about creating something.
Mm-hmm.
That thought God made as a common with God. In other words, the fact is that God can also make his thoughts actually create a world too. But the fact is that when God conceives something abstractly, he conceives the same way that man conceives something abstractly. In other words, God can take his thoughts, God can send his thoughts out, and that's an act of creation.
No.
Or God's thoughts come out of creation. But the act of thinking, the abstract thinking of God, right? Before it,
But it's a very different. Good, fine. So there's a common denominator, but they're very different kinds of acts.
No, but in other words, the Rambam is saying over here, when God thinks the thought,
Yeah.
right? He thinks the thought the same way that man thinks the thought. His thought is part of his essence. In other words, the Rambam is not there. God is actually thinking thoughts which, there's a fallout from the thoughts. The world is created. Because when God thinks something, eventually these thoughts actually reach fruition and create a world. But the actual act of thinking, in and of itself, right, is his essence that's good with the man.
Even then.
Yeah, even then.
So does that happen to my thoughts as well? They go and do something?
No, you're not a creator.
Darn. Nebuchadnezzar Chaim says I am.
The Rebbe Chaim says you're a creator because the Rebbe Chaim is asking God is God in and of himself. The Rebbe Chaim is speaking about the God-man relationship. Mitzida mitzideno. That's something different. That's easy. Okay, now I think we have over here what the Rambam is saying. What is he really thinking? What Rambam is saying like this. First of all, everything, what's the point of this? Lamai nafkamina. Man thinks like God thinks. Lamai nafkamina. Lamai nafkamina. What do I care? Just help me. Then $1.50 will get me on the subway. So what? I want to claim the following thing. The Rambam here has an incredible message. The message of the Rambam here is that if man thinks like God thinks, then man is able to uncover God's thinking, God's logic. In other words, the Meir Nevuchim, we actually spoke about the Meir Nevuchim being actually the Nevuah Moshe Rabbeinu. That was lectures 14 and 15. But Moshe Rabbeinu's Nevuah is to understand the logic of God. We spoke about that, we brought proofs from that in different places, especially in the Tamei Mitzvahs. In other words, man is able to understand the logic of God's thought. Namely, when God even commands a mitzvah, there's an underlying logic to it, and man is able to understand it. What allows the Rambam to understand God's thought? Because God thinks like man thinks. In other words, right, in other words, I'm able to understand your thoughts, your logic. Only because I think like you think. Don't bring me psukim in the Torah. I'll bring a pasuk when it's a right to me. Was that right? You won't bring a pasuk. The Rambam uses that in different things, whatever it is. But the fact is that what enables man to, the whole Negative Theology is coming in a good part to tell me that yes, God's mitzvahs, for example, have an underlying logical and conceptual framework, a process, and you can understand it. What allows you to understand why God or how God commanded the mitzvahs? Here's why, but it really should be the natural. What allows you to understand science? Isn't science God's thoughts? Well, since you think like God thinks, there's no reason why you're thinking the same as. Of course, you're not always thinking about it, but when you're thinking about it, you can understand the underlying logic of God's creation. Just like you can understand the underlying logic of God's mitzvahs, because God doesn't do anything without a reason and an underlying rationale. In other words, what the Rambam is doing here is explaining to me that ultimately man's ability to apprehend the Torah, the mitzvahs, the creation, whatever sislei Torah there is, man can apprehend these things. Why? Because man's mind works like God's mind works. Now, this seems like an incredible thing, but the fact is that I think we'll probably have to speak about it in later shiurim, that Gilgulim of the Rambam's thoughts actually are in the Nefesh HaChaim, in the Goin, that's in the Sarah Mamorim, or the Goin, Sarah Klom, the Goin, we spoke about this, right? Right? Kuchabricha v'raisa, Yisrael Chadu. Nefesh HaChaim is speaking about that the man thinks Kodesh Baruch Hu repeats things over to him. What does it mean, man, Kodesh Baruch Hu repeats the Torah of man for the Gemara Gittin of the base? Why does he repeat the Torah over to him? Man's thought is not less than God's thought. Of course it's Mitzidenu, I understand. But in other words, that's only like the Leshem says, the Rambam is before the Tzimtzum, and everything else is after the Tzimtzum. But the fact is, in other words, modulo the Tzimtzum, the fact is, the rational Jewish perspective and ontology, before the Tzimtzum, which is the Rambam, after the Tzimtzum is the Goin, maybe the Nefesh HaChaim, certainly the Leshem, is predicated upon the fact that when man thinks he's God, he's acting like God. And therefore, man has the potential to understand the rational order of the world. And that's what the Rambam says. That's the purpose. It's a very strange thing to think. Now, what the thing is, it's a violation of negative theology. Because negative theology says, I can't describe God. I can't describe God, but I can think like Him.
This solves Descartes' problem.
Where's solve Descartes' problem?
Descartes says, I don't know, my logic is true. Maybe my logic is false. So he has to have a whole thing that God wouldn't lie to him, and that God was the...
No, so it's the inverse of Descartes.
I'm saying,
okay, let me say that over in Lashon Nakiya. Descartes said, I can doubt everything, but I'm sure that I'm thinking. What's the purpose of my certainty? Because God. That's what Descartes says. This is the inverse. I am God, therefore I'm thinking. Descartes says, I think, therefore I exist. I'm saying, I'm think, therefore I'm God. Or I'm God, therefore I think. Anyway, in any case.
My thought process is valid.
That slugs up Descartes. What?
How do you know that a thought process is inherently logical?
Because that's what I'm saying.
We're saying potentially, I think. Every thought
No, potential or nothing. I'm sleeping. It's only what I'm actually thinking.
I'm saying that when you're actually thinking, your thoughts are potentially like the thoughts of God. Like, every thought is like...
That's what the Rambam is doing this whole chapter. See, you find this hard to believe. The Rambam said to you, I understand that you're going to find this hard to believe. Now, I'll tell you the truth. I happen to think that maybe he repeated himself a lot to confuse people, going back and forth. It was a pilpul, people falling asleep. But the fact is, was the Rambam done? But What the Rambam has done is taken all negative theology and turned it around. Negative theology, it turns out, is not only the means to not understanding God, not be able to speak about God, but somehow it's related to thinking like God. Now, how could that possibly be true? How can that possibly be? In other words, I want to claim it's not a contradiction. Let me explain to you why. In other words, like the question we're asking is this a contradictory theology? How do I know anything about God? In other words, if I can speak about God, I can describe Him, so I know something about God. But I can't describe God. I mean, God, the object, is removed from me. So how do I know something? How do I know anything? It must be, I have to be able to think like Him. I become God. In other words, we exchange roles. In other words, if it's like the Hamaska v'Hamuska. In other words, if I can't treat God as an object, I have to become God. In other words, if I treat God as an object, so there's no problem. I can study the object, come close to the object. It's Christianity. I say this. However, but if I can't treat God as an object, so the only way I can really have a connection with Him is thinking like Him. Somehow, the way I think is the way God thinks. In other words, the center of gravity of literature, rational philosophy, is the godless of man. That man imitates God. In fact, that's Nefesh HaChaim, Shar Aleph. That's called Tzelem Elokim. That's only after the Tzimtzum. But the point is that in rational philosophy, the central personage is not God, but it's man. This is something which we have to explore, and we have to see the currents and ramifications and future centuries of Jewish thinking, but the Rambam certainly has laid the foundations for this. In any case, I think we'll conclude over here. And this is something that I'm sure everybody wants to think about, reflect upon. I'm eager to hear your comments. In any case, for an undisclosed place in Yerushalayim, Kodesh, Kol Tuv V'Hatzlacha Rabbah.